What if the WNBA players are about to make the biggest gamble in league history, and they don't even realize how close they are to losing everything? 8 days. That's all that stood between a functioning season and total chaos. No deal. No agreement. No safety net. And right in the middle of it all, Kelsey Plum, first vice president of the WNBPA, finally spoke. Not with fireworks. Not with threats. Not with bold confidence. But with something far more revealing. She said players want to play. She admitted they're in a revenue share system. She warned that a strike would hurt both sides. And that's when fans started asking a question nobody in the league seems comfortable answering. If a strike hurts both sides, who does it hurt more? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. In a revenue share system, if there's no revenue, there's nothing to share. No games means no ticket sales. No broadcasts. No merchandise spikes. No momentum. And momentum is the one thing this league has fought years to build. This isn't just about negotiating a contract anymore. This is about leverage. This is about timing. This is about whether the players truly hold the power, or whether they've overplayed their hand at the worst possible moment. The deadline is looming. The owners aren't blinking. Fans are divided. And for the first time in weeks, one of the union's top leaders may have accidentally revealed just how fragile this situation really is. But to understand how we got here, you have to understand the clock that's ticking behind the scenes, and why 8 days might change everything. 8 days. That number doesn't sound dramatic until you realize what it represents. 8 days before players could be forced into a strike. 8 days before negotiations cross from tense into dangerous. 8 days before the 2026 season starts feeling less like a guarantee and more like a question mark. Deadlines in sports negotiations are different from political theater. They aren't symbolic. They're financial pressure points. And once you hit that pressure point, the consequences ripple fast. The current situation isn't just about percentages on paper. It's about the structure of the league itself. The WNBA operates under a revenue share model, something the players fought hard to secure. On the surface, that sounds empowering. If the league grows, the players grow with it. But here's the catch nobody talks about loud enough. Revenue sharing only works when revenue is flowing. And revenue only flows when games are played. When Kelsey Plum referenced the revenue share system, she wasn't just repeating a contract detail. She was indirectly acknowledging the time constraint built into that system. If players strike, revenue pauses. If revenue pauses, there's nothing to distribute. And suddenly the leverage calculation shifts. Because here's what makes this moment different from past labor tensions. The league is in a growth phase. Attendance is up. Media deals are expanding. Sponsorship buzz is rising. The spotlight is hotter than it's been in years. That growth is fragile. Momentum in sports isn't permanent. It's rented. Fans who just started tuning in won't automatically stick around if the season stalls. Casual viewers don't wait patiently for labor disputes to resolve. They move on. So when the owners reportedly signal they're willing to wait until the 11th hour, that's not just posturing. That's strategic patience. Owners can afford to wait longer than players can afford to miss checks. That's the uncomfortable math. The players believe they deserve a larger slice of the pie, and many fans agree. But owners control the oven. And if the oven gets turned off, nobody eats. This is where the situation gets tense. Because the closer you get to a strike deadline, the more both sides start calculating endurance instead of fairness. How long can players go without salary? How long can ownership groups withstand public pressure? How much financial burn can each side absorb? And here's where things get even more complicated. The league's revenue isn't evenly distributed across every player. It never is in professional sports. There are stars. There are role players. There are veterans nearing retirement. There are rookies trying to establish themselves. A strike impacts each of them differently. For some, it's about legacy and principle. For others, it's about mortgages and family stability. For others, it's about losing momentum in a breakout year. That internal pressure doesn't show up in press statements, but it exists. And when the deadline gets this close, those private pressures start influencing public decisions. The phrase "players want to play" sounds simple, but inside that sentence is urgency. It's not defiance. It's not escalation. It's awareness. Because the longer this drags out, the more the risk shifts away from symbolic strength and toward real-world consequences. Every day closer to March 10th increases the stakes. Fans start speculating about lockouts. Media narratives start forming. Replacement player rumors begin circulating. Sponsors start quietly evaluating contingency plans. And suddenly, this isn't just negotiation theater. It's a staring contest with millions of dollars and the league's reputation sitting in the middle. What makes this even more intense is perception. If players strike, the public conversation won't immediately be about contract language. It'll be about optics. Are players being unreasonable? Are owners being greedy? Is the league collapsing under its own growth? Public perception matters more than ever right now because the WNBA is still in a branding expansion phase. Every headline shapes long-term trust. That's why this deadline isn't just procedural. It's psychological. The side that blinks first controls the narrative. And the side that miscalculates public sympathy loses leverage instantly. Which brings us back to Kelsey Plum. Because when she acknowledged the revenue share and the urgency, she may have been trying to calm the waters. But some fans didn't hear calm. They heard concern. And if fans are starting to sense uncertainty from union leadership, that changes everything. Because in negotiations, confidence is currency. And right now, that currency is being tested. But what Kelsey Plum said next, and how fans reacted, would take this tension to a completely different level. And that's where things started to turn. When a role player speaks, it's commentary. When a star speaks, it's influence. But when the first vice president of the players' union speaks, it's signal. And that's why every word Kelsey Plum said carried weight far beyond a simple interview. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She didn't promise a hard line. Instead, she said something that sounded measured, almost cautious. I want to play and players want to play. At first glance, that feels reassuring. It sounds like leadership trying to steady the ship. It sounds like someone who understands that fans are anxious and wants to calm the temperature. But leadership tone matters in moments like this. And tone is exactly what people started dissecting. She continued, explaining that they are in a revenue share system, that they fought hard for it, that the time constraint creates urgency, that a strike would be the worst thing for both sides. That's not war language. That's reality language. And here's why that stood out. In high-stakes negotiations, public messaging is usually firm, strategic, confident. You project strength. You avoid showing pressure. But Plum's comments didn't feel aggressive. They felt aware, almost like someone acknowledging the limits of the situation. When she pointed out the revenue share structure, she indirectly highlighted the union's biggest vulnerability. Because revenue share sounds powerful until you imagine what happens when revenue stops. If players strike, the league doesn't just lose money. The players lose their share of that money. So the longer the dispute drags on, the more the system they fought for works against them. And fans caught that. They heard the subtext. Because when she says a strike hurts both sides, what some listeners interpret is this: it might hurt one side more. And that's where the narrative started to shift. Instead of rallying fans behind a hardline stance, the comments section began filling with skepticism. Take the deal. A strike hurts the players more. What leverage do they really have? That reaction wasn't random. It reflects something deeper happening in the public conversation around the league. There's been a growing belief that the WNBPA may have misjudged its timing. Yes, the league is growing. Yes, ratings have improved. Yes, attention is at an all-time high. But growth doesn't automatically equal unlimited leverage, especially when ownership groups have deeper financial reserves and diversified revenue streams outside the league itself. And here's where things get even more layered. Kelsey Plum isn't just speaking as a player. She's speaking as union leadership. That means she has to balance internal unity with external optics. Inside the locker rooms, players might be fired up. They might believe strongly in holding firm. They might feel this is the moment to demand structural change. But outside those locker rooms, fans are calculating consequences. They're thinking about canceled games. They're thinking about lost momentum. They're thinking about how fragile professional sports leagues can be when public trust is shaken. Plum's statement didn't ignite the fan base. It made them nervous. Because instead of hearing defiance, many heard hesitation. And hesitation in negotiations can be interpreted as uncertainty. Now, that doesn't mean she lacks confidence. It may mean she's being realistic. But realism doesn't always inspire confidence in a standoff, especially when the clock is ticking. And here's something else that matters. She acknowledged urgency, time constraint, sense of pressure. When you publicly admit urgency, you subtly reveal that the deadline is affecting your side. In negotiations, the side under more time pressure typically has less leverage. Owners can wait. Players can't play without games. Owners don't depend on game checks the same way athletes depend on seasonal earnings. So when fans heard urgency from union leadership, some interpreted it as an imbalance. And that's when the conversation turned from, are the players justified, to, are the players prepared? There's a difference. Being justified doesn't guarantee victory. Preparation determines outcome. The other layer here is perception of unity. When Plum says players want to play, it suggests not every player may be comfortable with the idea of a prolonged strike. That phrase isn't accidental. It's reassurance. But reassurance is usually used when there's fear of division. And division is deadly in labor disputes. If ownership senses cracks in player unity, their incentive to hold firm increases dramatically. Because nothing collapses a strike faster than internal disagreement. So now, the public sees 3 pressure points forming. 1. The ticking deadline. 2. The revenue share vulnerability. 3. Potential cracks in collective resolve. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a show of strength starts looking like a tightrope walk. But the real explosion didn't happen in the interview itself. It happened in the reaction. Because once fans started speaking, the temperature changed completely. And the backlash wasn't subtle. It was brutal. And that's where this story took a turn nobody expected. The reaction wasn't quiet. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't patient. It was immediate. Within hours of Kelsey Plum's comments circulating, the temperature online shifted from curiosity to frustration. And frustration spreads faster than facts. At first, it was mild skepticism. Just take the deal. That's not leadership. Why risk the season? But then the tone sharpened. Some fans accused union leadership of overplaying its hand. Others said the players were gambling with the league's momentum. A few went even further, claiming the strike talk felt disconnected from reality. That word, reality, kept surfacing. Because from the outside looking in, fans don't see spreadsheets. They see growth. They see sold-out arenas. They see rising TV numbers. They see star players trending. And they assume leverage is automatic. But then Plum's reminder about revenue share complicated that assumption. If revenue stops, everything stops. That hit fans differently. Suddenly, this wasn't a heroic labor fight. It looked like a risk. And risk makes people uncomfortable. Especially when they just started investing emotionally in the product. The WNBA has been building momentum brick by brick. Casual viewers who didn't tune in 5 years ago are tuning in now. New fans are buying merch. Social media engagement is higher. Media coverage is broader. That kind of growth feels fragile. And fans know it. So when strike talk becomes real, not hypothetical, the fear isn't just about contracts. It's about interruption. Momentum in sports is like a wave. If you ride it, it grows. If you stall it, it crashes. And some fans are terrified that this dispute could crash the wave. That's why the comments weren't just criticism of Plum. They were expressions of anxiety. People don't lash out when they don't care. They lash out when they think something valuable is at risk. But here's where it gets complicated. The backlash also revealed something deeper, a divide in how fans view player leverage. There's a growing narrative that the league's current revenue spike is heavily concentrated around a small number of high-profile players. That creates tension, because if the majority of the revenue buzz is tied to a few names, some fans start questioning how strong the collective leverage really is. Is it unified, or is it top-heavy? That's a dangerous conversation, because if fans begin believing that only a handful of players truly move the financial needle, the idea of a full league strike becomes less intimidating to ownership. Public perception influences negotiation strength. And right now, perception feels divided. Some fans support the players completely. They argue the athletes deserve a bigger share. They argue ownership has historically underpaid. They argue this is the moment to demand fairness. But others are saying something different. They're saying timing matters. They're saying growth phases aren't the time to threaten shutdowns. They're saying if the league stalls now, casual fans won't return. And that second group is growing louder. The most telling part? The phrase "strike hurts the players more" started trending in comment sections. That's not just an opinion. That's a shift in sympathy. And sympathy is power. In labor disputes, public sympathy often becomes the deciding factor. If fans believe ownership is greedy, pressure mounts quickly. If fans believe players are miscalculating, that pressure flips. Right now, the narrative isn't clearly favoring one side. It's confused. And confusion benefits the side with deeper pockets. Because while social media debates rage, ownership groups don't react emotionally. They react strategically. If they sense fans won't overwhelmingly blame them for a strike, their willingness to hold firm increases. And here's the twist. Kelsey Plum is now trending in the algorithm. Not because she declared war, but because she broke silence. She became the face of the moment. Fair or not, that's how visibility works. Leadership attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny amplifies division. Now the story isn't just about contract numbers. It's about whether union leadership fully understands the risk of this standoff. And once that doubt enters the public conversation, it spreads. But the backlash wasn't the most dangerous development. Something else started circulating. Something that changed the stakes completely. 3 words that send shockwaves through any professional league. Replacement players. And once that idea enters the chat, everything escalates. At first, it sounded like internet noise. Speculation. Overreaction. Just fans throwing out worst-case scenarios. But then the phrase started appearing more frequently. Replacement players. 3 words that instantly change the energy of any labor dispute. Because once that possibility enters the conversation, this stops being a moral standoff and becomes a survival test. Now let's be clear. There has been no official confirmation that replacement players are being prepared. No formal announcement. No public plan. But in negotiations like this, you don't need confirmation for leverage to shift. You only need plausibility. If ownership can even suggest the possibility of fielding games without current union players, the psychological pressure multiplies overnight. Because here's what that threat represents. It says, we can keep the product moving. It says, we are prepared. It says, we don't have to blink first. And whether or not that plan would succeed long-term is almost secondary. The short-term impact is what matters. It plants doubt. It forces players to consider scenarios that feel uncomfortable. Imagine waking up during a strike and seeing games still being played. Different jerseys, different rosters, same arenas, same broadcast deals. Even if fans criticize it, the games exist. That image alone changes the negotiation temperature. Now suddenly the players aren't just negotiating percentages. They're negotiating relevance. Because sports history has shown something uncomfortable. When leagues survive disruption, they often gain leverage the second time around. Replacement players have been used before in professional sports. Sometimes temporarily, sometimes controversially, but always as a pressure tactic. And pressure tactics work when one side depends more on immediate income. Owners operate businesses beyond a single season. Players operate within limited career windows. Time impacts them differently. A missed season for ownership is a financial setback. A missed season for an athlete can mean lost prime years, lost endorsements, lost rhythm, lost opportunities. That imbalance doesn't disappear just because negotiations are tense. It lingers beneath every decision. Now here's where it gets even more strategic. The WNBA is in a growth phase. That growth has attracted new talent pools, international players, and signed prospects, athletes outside the traditional spotlight. If even a fraction of them would be willing to step into temporary roles during a dispute, ownership doesn't need perfection. They just need continuity. Continuity protects broadcast agreements. Continuity reassures sponsors. Continuity preserves scheduling obligations. And continuity weakens strike leverage. Even if fans protest at first, habit is powerful. If games are on television, some people will watch. If highlights circulate online, engagement continues. And if that happens, the union's most powerful weapon, stoppage, becomes diluted. That's why the replacement player conversation is dangerous. Not because it guarantees success for ownership, but because it changes the risk calculation for players. Now the question becomes, are the players willing to test whether ownership is bluffing? Because once you call that bluff, there's no halfway point. Either ownership folds quickly, or they don't. And if they don't, the leverage swings hard. That's why the online chatter about replacement players hit differently. It wasn't about fairness. It was about feasibility. Fans began asking uncomfortable questions. Would people still watch? Would sponsors still support? Would the league survive a short-term substitution? And every time someone answered maybe, the union's bargaining strength quietly eroded. This is where perception becomes almost as powerful as reality. Even if ownership has no immediate plan to deploy replacements, letting that idea circulate creates psychological weight. It makes players feel the ground shifting. It introduces uncertainty into what might have felt like a unified front. And uncertainty fractures resolve. Now think about Kelsey Plum's earlier comments in this context. She emphasized urgency. She acknowledged revenue constraints. She warned a strike hurts both sides. If replacement players even enter the realm of possibility, that urgency doubles. Because now a strike doesn't just mean lost games. It could mean lost narrative control, lost fan sympathy, lost exclusivity. And once exclusivity in professional sports is challenged, it's incredibly hard to reclaim. But here's the deeper tension. If players back down out of fear of replacements, it signals vulnerability. If they push forward confidently, they risk testing ownership's endurance. Either path carries risk. There is no clean outcome. And that's what makes this moment feel unstable. The league is not established enough to casually absorb a season-long disruption. But it's big enough now that ownership might believe they can withstand short-term turbulence. That gray area is dangerous, because both sides may believe they hold the stronger hand. And in poker, when both players think they're winning, someone eventually goes all in. The replacement player conversation might never materialize into action. But the fact that it's being whispered at all tells you something important. Trust between sides is thinning. Negotiations are no longer friendly. And the clock is no longer symbolic. It's threatening. But here's where things become even more uncomfortable. Because beyond replacement players, there's a deeper issue nobody wants to admit out loud. And it revolves around one brutal question. How much revenue does the league actually generate? And who is responsible for generating it? That's where the leverage debate becomes brutally honest. And that's where this situation becomes explosive. Revenue share sounds powerful. It sounds progressive. It sounds like ownership and players finally sitting on the same side of the table. But revenue share only works when the revenue is undeniable. And that's where this situation gets uncomfortable. Because behind closed doors, the real debate isn't about fairness. It's about scale. How big is the pie? And who actually brings people to the table? The league has undeniably grown. Attendance spikes. Merchandise sales rising. National broadcasts drawing stronger numbers. Social media engagement climbing. Those are facts. But growth percentage and total revenue aren't the same thing. A league can grow rapidly and still operate on thinner margins than the public assumes. That distinction matters in negotiations. Because when players push for a larger share, ownership calculates sustainability. They don't look at momentum. They look at margins. They don't look at trending hashtags. They look at long-term operating costs. And this is where the conversation turns sharp. The WNBA's recent surge in attention hasn't been evenly distributed. There are specific players who generate massive ticket demand. Specific matchups that spike ratings. Specific names that dominate headlines. And when revenue concentration becomes top-heavy, it complicates collective bargaining. Because if the majority of buzz is attached to a small cluster of stars, ownership can quietly argue something dangerous. The growth isn't fully systemic yet. It's star-driven, and star-driven growth is volatile. If a single star is injured, if a single headline shifts, if public attention moves on, revenue projections change instantly. That's the risk ownership is calculating. Now from the player's perspective, the argument is simple. The league is growing because of the players. Therefore, the players deserve more. That logic makes sense. But ownership counters with a different logic. Growth doesn't equal profitability. And profitability determines what can sustainably be shared. This is where the revenue share structure becomes tricky. It aligns incentives when money is flowing. But during tension, it exposes fragility. Because if the players strike, the revenue they're negotiating to increase immediately drops to zero. And once revenue hits zero, the leverage resets. Ownership groups often have diversified portfolios. They own other teams, other businesses, other revenue streams. WNBA players have careers tied directly to the season. That imbalance doesn't disappear during negotiation. It intensifies. Now here's the brutal question some fans have started asking. Does the union actually hold more leverage than ownership right now? That's not a moral question. It's a financial one. Leverage is about who can endure longer, who can survive a pause, who feels pressure first. When Kelsey Plum mentioned urgency, some interpreted it as recognition of this imbalance. Because urgency implies sensitivity to delay, and delay favors the side with deeper reserves. But the revenue conversation gets even more layered, because the league is also negotiating future growth, media deals, expansion, brand positioning. All of that depends on stability. Sponsors don't like unpredictability. Broadcasters don't like uncertainty. Corporate partners don't like labor volatility. If a strike drags, those partners may hesitate next time negotiations arise. That ripple effect doesn't just impact this contract. It impacts long-term valuation. Ownership knows that. Players know that too. But here's the tension. Players may believe this is the exact moment to push harder, while the spotlight is hot. Ownership may believe this is the exact moment to resist, while momentum is still fragile. Same moment, opposite conclusions. And that's why this standoff feels explosive. Because both sides think timing is on their side. But timing is neutral. It rewards whoever calculates more accurately. Now add one more uncomfortable element. Public perception of who drives revenue. When fans begin debating whether one or two stars are responsible for ticket surges, it fractures the collective bargaining narrative. Collective bargaining relies on unity. If the public starts believing revenue is star-specific, they may view a league-wide strike differently. Instead of players versus owners, it becomes stars versus system. And that perception weakens solidarity, even if it's unfair, even if it oversimplifies reality. Optics influence leverage. And right now, optics are complicated. The league is bigger than ever, but still building. The revenue is rising, but not infinite. The players are unified publicly, but facing private pressure. Ownership is silent, but calculating. And Kelsey Plum, standing at the center of this storm, may have unintentionally revealed that both sides understand something fans are just starting to realize. This isn't a guaranteed win for anyone. If the players push too hard, they risk stalling growth. If ownership holds too firm, they risk alienating the talent that fuels the product. Either side miscalculates, and the damage could stretch beyond one season. And that brings us to the scenario nobody wants to imagine. What if this doesn't resolve quickly? What if the deadline passes? What if the season itself becomes collateral damage? Because if that happens, the 2026 season might not just be delayed. It could be permanently altered. And that's where the stakes become historic. Imagine this. The deadline passes. No handshake. No late-night breakthrough tweet. No deal reached headline. Just silence. Then confirmation. Games postponed. Training camps paused. Season uncertain. At first, it would feel temporary. Fans would say, they'll figure it out. Analysts would predict a short delay. Optimists would expect common sense to win. But every day that passes without resolution changes the psychology of the situation. Because once a season is disrupted, the conversation shifts from negotiation to survival. And survival mode is dangerous. The 2026 season isn't just another year on the calendar. It represents momentum. Television partnerships expanding. Corporate sponsorships deepening. New fans discovering the league for the first time. Expansion discussions. Brand elevation. All of that depends on continuity. Professional sports rely on rhythm. Opening night. Mid-season storylines. Playoff buildup. Finals drama. When that rhythm breaks, rebuilding it isn't automatic. Casual viewers are not loyal by default. They are curious by default. Curiosity fades quickly. If games disappear from schedules, other entertainment fills the gap. Other leagues dominate headlines. Other storylines take over. And when the WNBA tries to return, it might not return to the same audience size. Momentum lost is not momentum paused. It's momentum reset. Now imagine a shortened season. Compressed schedule. Fewer games. Reduced player income. Broadcast reshuffling. Sponsor renegotiations. That's not catastrophic, but it's destabilizing. Now imagine something worse. A full cancellation. That's when long-term damage sets in. Because investors don't just look at one season. They evaluate stability. Future expansion plans would stall. Media deal leverage weakens. Corporate partners grow cautious. Players who rely on consistent exposure lose endorsement value. Young prospects entering the league lose development opportunities. Veterans nearing retirement lose irreplaceable years. And fans, especially new fans, feel burned. They waited. They invested emotionally. And the product disappeared. That emotional break is hard to repair. Now here's the part that's rarely said out loud. If the 2026 season collapses or shrinks significantly, the narrative won't simply blame one side. It will question the league's structural maturity. Is it stable enough to handle growth? Is the business model sustainable? Is leadership aligned? Those questions affect valuation. They affect credibility. They affect trust. And trust is the currency professional leagues depend on. But here's where it becomes even more layered. The WNBA is not negotiating in a vacuum. It's negotiating during a period where women's sports are under a brighter spotlight than ever. Momentum across multiple leagues. Increased investment. Growing global interest. If the WNBA stalls during this surge, it risks losing positioning within that broader movement. Other leagues will continue advancing. Other opportunities will absorb attention. And when you fall behind in sports, catching up requires twice the effort. That's why this deadline feels heavier than past disputes. The stakes are amplified by timing. The league is climbing, and climbing leagues cannot afford prolonged turbulence. Now think about the internal pressure. Players want improved compensation. Ownership wants sustainable scaling. Both positions are rational, but rational positions can still collide destructively. Because if neither side adjusts expectations in time, the system doesn't bend. It breaks. And the 2026 season becomes the casualty. But there's another psychological element here. Fatigue. Negotiations create exhaustion. Fans get tired of labor headlines. Media gets tired of repeating the same talking points. Sponsors get tired of uncertainty. When fatigue sets in, whoever controls the simplest narrative often wins. Ownership's simplest narrative would be, "We made a fair offer." The player's simplest narrative would be, "We deserve a fair share." Whichever message resonates stronger determines public alignment, and public alignment determines pressure. If fans grow impatient with disruption, pressure shifts toward the union. If fans believe ownership is exploiting growth, pressure flips. Right now, that alignment is unstable, which means the next few days are critical. Because once the deadline hits, optics move faster than facts. And optics decide how history remembers moments like this. Will this be remembered as the season players secured transformative change, or the season that nearly derailed the league's rise? The difference between those two outcomes may come down to who blinks first. And that brings us back to Kelsey Plum. Because while fans debate leverage and replacement players and revenue structures, she's standing at the intersection of all of it. And what she does next might define her career beyond the court. This might not be the biggest game of Kelsey Plum's career, but it could be the biggest moment of her legacy. Because championships are remembered. Scoring titles are remembered. All-star appearances are remembered. But leadership during crisis? That's what defines how history writes your name. Right now, Plum isn't just another player commenting on negotiations. She's the first vice president of the WNBPA. That title carries weight. It means players trust her voice in rooms fans never see. It means she's involved in conversations that determine millions of dollars. It means when she speaks publicly, she isn't speaking casually. Every word signals something. And in this moment, her words are being dissected more than ever. When she said players want to play, some saw unity. Others saw concern. When she acknowledged revenue share urgency, some saw transparency. Others saw vulnerability. That's the burden of leadership. You don't control how your message lands. You only control what you say. And in tense labor moments, perception often matters more than intent. Plum is navigating a razor's edge. On one side, she has to represent the collective will of the players. She cannot appear weak internally. If teammates believe leadership lacks resolve, cracks form. And cracks destroy negotiating strength. On the other side, she has to consider public optics. She cannot appear reckless. If fans believe union leadership is gambling with the league's growth, sympathy evaporates. Balancing those two pressures is not easy. Especially when the clock is ticking. Especially when social media amplifies every word. Especially when ownership is silent. That silence from ownership is strategic. They aren't trending. They aren't explaining. They aren't defending themselves publicly. Which means the spotlight falls heavily on union voices. And Plum stepped into that spotlight. Now here's the reality few acknowledge. Union leadership often absorbs the blame no matter what happens. If players strike and public opinion turns negative, leadership is criticized. If players accept a deal perceived as weak, leadership is criticized. It's a no-win visibility position. But there's something else happening beneath the surface. This moment is testing player unity. Behind closed doors, there are likely differing opinions. Veterans nearing retirement may want stability. Younger players building brands may want leverage maximized. Role players may worry about missed checks. Stars may feel they can withstand financial pauses. Those internal tensions don't show publicly. But union leadership must manage them quietly. That's exhausting. And when Plum speaks with measured urgency instead of fiery aggression, it may reflect the complexity she's balancing. She's not just negotiating against ownership. She's holding together dozens of perspectives inside the locker room. That's not weakness. That's pressure. But here's where things get delicate. If fans begin believing that leadership is unsure, if media narratives begin suggesting the union is overextended, ownership gains psychological advantage. Negotiation is as much about mental stamina as it is about numbers. The side perceived as more confident often influences momentum. Right now, Plum is being forced to project confidence while acknowledging reality. That's difficult, because reality includes uncomfortable truths. The revenue share model has limits. The growth phase is fragile. Ownership can endure longer. Public sympathy is divided, and the replacement player conversation exists in the background. Navigating all of that while staying firm requires calculated messaging, and one interview can tilt perception unexpectedly. Now imagine what happens next. If the deal gets done quickly, Plum looks steady and strategic. If the strike happens and resolves favorably for players, she looks strong and disciplined. But if the strike drags, if fans grow frustrated, if revenue dips, if replacement players become real, then her early comments will be replayed endlessly. That's how modern sports media works. Moments are archived, quotes are clipped, narratives are shaped, and leadership is judged retroactively. That's why this moment feels bigger than contract language. It feels like a crossroads, not just for the league, but for her career identity. Will she be remembered as the leader who helped secure transformational change, or the face of a miscalculated standoff? That depends on what happens next. Because here's the final tension. The union must decide whether to escalate or settle. Ownership must decide whether to wait or compromise. Fans must decide where sympathy lies. And Kelsey Plum must stand firm in whatever direction the union chooses. No middle ground. No easy outcome. Just pressure. And the clock is still ticking. So now the real question isn't whether a strike is possible. It's whether both sides truly understand what they're risking. Because in a revenue share system, the battle isn't just about who deserves more. It's about who can afford to wait. This was never just about a percentage. It was never just about one quote. And it was never just about Kelsey Plum. It's about power. It's about timing. It's about whether growth automatically equals leverage, or whether leverage has to be earned differently at every stage of a league's evolution. Right now, both sides believe they are protecting the future. The players believe they are fighting for fairness, for a structure that reflects the league's rise. Ownership believes it is protecting sustainability, ensuring the league doesn't expand faster than it can financially stabilize. Those two goals don't sound incompatible. But when money, ego, timing, and public pressure collide, even aligned goals can explode. The strike deadline is more than a calendar date. It's a pressure test. If a deal is reached before it hits, this moment will be remembered as tension before progress. If the deadline passes without resolution, it becomes something else entirely. A gamble. And gambles in professional sports rarely come without consequence. Because here's the brutal truth. Momentum is fragile. Fans who just started believing in the product won't wait forever. Sponsors who just increased investment won't tolerate prolonged instability. Media partners who just expanded coverage won't reward disruption. And players who only have a limited career window can't recover lost seasons. Every side is risking something different. Ownership risks reputation. Players risk income and public sympathy. The league risks trajectory. But the biggest risk of all, miscalculation. If the union believes ownership will fold quickly, and they don't, the pressure intensifies fast. If ownership believes players will cave quickly, and they don't, the season hangs in the balance. This isn't about who deserves more. It's about who reads the room more accurately. Because in a revenue share system, power shifts the second revenue pauses. And once it pauses, whoever can endure longer controls the narrative. That's why Kelsey Plum's words hit differently. They weren't loud. They weren't defiant. They were aware. And awareness in moments like this reveals something important. Everyone understands what's at stake. No one wants to be the side blamed for collapse. No one wants to be remembered as the reason momentum stalled. But history doesn't reward intention. It rewards outcome. If this deal gets done, this will look like strategic tension. If it doesn't, this could become the turning point people look back on years from now. The moment when the league either solidified its future or stumbled during its rise. And the clock is still ticking. 8 days, then 7, then 6, and every passing hour increases the pressure. So now the real question becomes this. Will both sides step back before the line is crossed? Or are we about to witness one of the most defining labor standoffs in league history? Because once that line is crossed, there's no easy rewind. If you want real-time breakdowns as this situation unfolds, not surface-level headlines, but the deeper leverage battles happening behind the scenes, make sure you hit subscribe right now. This story is moving fast. Negotiations can shift overnight. Statements can change everything. And the next update could completely flip the narrative. If you care about the future of the league, if you want to understand what's really happening beyond the press releases, and if you want the full analysis when the deadline hits, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this isn't over. Not even close. And what happens next might shock everyone.